There are some phone calls that change everything. They divide your life into before and after. That night I was standing in my kitchen, half awake, holding a cup of chamomile tea. The world outside my window was silent. The clock had just crossed midnight. I had returned from Florence only a week ago, and for the first time in years I was learning how to be still. Then my phone rang. My daughter's name glowed on the screen. I smiled before I answered, but the moment I heard her voice, my world tilted. She was crying, barely breathing. She said, "Mom, I am at the police station. They say I did it." I froze. The words made no sense. For a heartbeat, I thought I had misheard her. But she repeated them, her voice trembling. "Mom, they say I did it." I remember gripping the counter to steady myself. I said, "Emma, calm down. Tell me what happened." But before she could speak, I heard a man's voice in the background asking for her phone. Then the line went dead. I stood there staring at the screen, feeling something cold crawl up my spine. I whispered to myself, "She called me from the police station, Mom, they say I did it." I flew home and found the truth hiding in plain sight. What I did next changed everything. I didn't know then that those words would become a memory I would never escape. The house felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves were listening. I tried calling her again, no answer. I sent a message that simply said, "I am coming." I did not even know where she was, but I knew I had to move. Within minutes I had booked a flight. Florence to Boston, first flight out. My hands were shaking as I zipped my suitcase. The kettle was still whistling when I left the house. On the plane I could not close my eyes. The memory of her voice kept repeating in my head. "Mom, they say I did it." My daughter Emma was 26. A woman who had built her life around kindness. She worked at our family foundation, volunteered at the shelter, never even took more than she earned. And now she was in a police station, accused of something she would never do. Somewhere above the clouds, I looked at my reflection in the airplane window. I could see the fatigue, the regret. I whispered to the darkness, "Hold on, Emma. I am coming." When I landed, the sun was already up. My phone was flooded with messages. The first was from my older daughter, Claire. "Don't overreact, Mom. Emma got herself into trouble again. Dad's handling it." The word again felt like a knife. I called Claire immediately, but she did not pick up. I took a cab straight to the police station. The driver looked uncomfortable the whole way. When I asked if the case was serious, he hesitated and said, "Ma'am, they said she was released this morning with conditions." Conditions. That word echoed in my mind. When I reached the station, the sergeant recognized my last name. He looked at me with tired kindness and said, "Mrs. Bennett, your daughter was frightened. We told her she could call you, but she said she didn't want to make it worse." I asked him, "Worse than what?" He sighed and said, "She is accused of stealing from her employer, the family foundation. There are missing funds, and her password was used to make the transfer. But something feels off. It's too neat, too neat." 2 words that told me everything I needed to know. Someone had arranged this. Someone close. I asked where she went after they released her. He checked a note and said she told them she would stay somewhere safe. She didn't want to go home. I left the station with a weight in my chest I could not name. As the car rolled past the city streets, I thought about our last real conversation. It had been months ago. She had wanted to start a shelter of her own, something small but meaningful. Her father called it foolish, said she was not ready for responsibility. I had stayed silent then, like I always did. Now I wished I had spoken. Silence can betray as deeply as lies. When I reached the house, the air felt colder than it should. Claire opened the door, perfectly composed, and said, "You really flew all the way back for this." I said, "She's my daughter." She replied, "She's not here. She is staying somewhere else." It's complicated. At dinner, my ex-husband spoke in his usual measured tone. He said there was evidence. Her password, her signature, her laptop. The board was furious. He said he was trying to contain the damage. I looked at him and realized he was not talking about our child. He was talking about the foundation, about the reputation, about money. That night I went to Emma's room. The air was still, untouched. A faint scent of lavender lingered, the one she always sprayed on her pillows. On her desk was a photo of the 3 of us, back when laughter was effortless. I traced the edges of the frame and whispered, "What happened to us?" The woman in the mirror across the room did not look like me. She looked like someone who had waited too long to fight. As I turned off the light, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. A whispering voice said, "She's been sleeping in her car near the old community center. Don't tell anyone I told you." Then the line went silent. I called back immediately, but there was no answer. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the phone. That same stillness filled the room, the kind that comes before a storm. Somewhere outside, rain began to fall. I reached for my keys and stood. My heartbeat slowed. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was certain they could twist records and forge signatures. They could bury her name under the weight of family pride. But I was still her mother, and I was going to find her. When I stepped outside, the air smelled like iron and wet earth. The city lights blurred in the rain. I started the car and whispered into the night. She called me crying from the police station. They said she did it. But I know my daughter. Whatever they think she took, it's not nearly as valuable as what they already stole from us. And with that, I drove toward the rain, toward the truth, and toward the beginning of the fight that would change everything. When I reached the house, it did not feel like home anymore. The walls looked cleaner than they should, and every corner smelled of polish. Not life. The driver left the suitcase at the door and disappeared down the driveway as if afraid to linger. I stood there for a moment under the porch light, listening to the wind move through the trees. Even the air felt cautious. Claire opened the door, her smile thin and perfect. She said, "You look tired." I said, "I have not slept." She stepped aside and said, "Dad is in the study. He has calls. You can wait in the living room." The way she said it made it sound like a hotel check-in, not a welcome home. I walked past her and felt the chill spread across the marble floor. The house was the same, yet everything had shifted. The paintings were straight, the flowers on the table new. But there was something missing: warmth, laughter, maybe truth. I put my coat down and looked around the living room. I had chosen those curtains. Once I remembered arguing for soft blue because Emma loved the color. Now they were beige, neutral, safe. I realized the house had been redecorated to erase her, and maybe Claire followed me with her phone in her hand. She said, "Mom, please do not start. We are all upset, and the last thing we need is more drama." I looked at her and asked, "Where's your sister?" She said, "I told you she is not here, and she has no one to blame but herself." I said, "Claire, she called me crying from a police station. She said she did it." She sounded terrified. "Do you really believe she stole from us?" Claire looked away. She said, "There is evidence, Mom. Her password. Her signature." "Dad said the accountant confirmed it," I said. "And you believe that?" Without hearing her side, she shrugged and said, "You always defend her." I wanted to shout, but I did not. I have learned that silence sometimes frightens people more than anger. I went upstairs to my old room. It smelled of cleaning spray, not memory. My ex-husband Daniel knocked on the door a few minutes later. He said, "I heard you came straight from the airport." I nodded. He said, "I know you are emotional, but we need to handle this carefully. The foundation is in a fragile position. The donors are watching." I said, "Daniel, our daughter is sleeping in her car." He looked uncomfortable and said, "She made choices. I cannot fix those." I said she was accused, not convicted. He said, "Then let the process work out." I said, "Process does not feed her or clear her name." He sighed, said, "Lawyers are involved. We will know soon," and walked away. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hall, each one colder than the last. I sat on the edge of the bed thinking about how money makes people deaf. It silences compassion. It rewrites guilt into strategy. I looked out of the window. The garden lights glowed softly like ghosts. I remembered Emma running across that same lawn barefoot when she was little, chasing fireflies with Claire. Her laughter filled the night. Back then, I believed families were built on love. Now I was starting to think they were built on secrets and appearances. The next morning, I went into the kitchen. The housekeeper paused when she saw me. She looked worried. I asked her quietly, "Have you seen Emma?" She shook her head, but hesitated before turning away. I said, "Please, if you know something, tell me." She whispered, "I saw her car near the old community center last week, but she was not there when I went back. I think she is staying nearby, but I did not tell anyone, they would be angry." I touched her arm and said, "Thank you, you did the right thing." I left before anyone else woke up. The roads were empty, fog hanging low over the fields. The community center stood at the edge of town, paint peeling signboard swinging. I drove slowly around the back lot, and then I saw it, an old silver sedan with clothes piled on the back seat, a cracked window, and inside a small blanket folded carefully. It was hers. She had always folded things too neatly. I parked a few feet away and waited. I did not want to frighten her. If she was nearby, after a while I saw movement. A figure walking from behind the building. She wore a faded sweatshirt, her hair tied back in a messy knot. When she realized it was me, she froze, then turned as if to run. I stepped out and said, "Emma, wait, please." She stopped but did not look at me. She said, "Mom, you should not be here." I said, "You should not be here either." She shook her head, tears spilling. She said, "I cannot go home. They all think I did it, the police, the family, even Claire." I said, "I do not." She looked at me through the rain, her eyes tired, swollen. She said, "You should, they have proof." I said, "Proof can lie." She whispered, "You do not understand." I said, "Then help me understand." She said, "It is not safe." I said, "Safe for who?" She looked down and whispered, "For you." I felt the ground tilt again. I asked, "What do you mean?" But she stepped back and said, "Just go. Mom, please." Her voice cracked on the word please. It was not anger. It was fear. I wanted to hold her, but she flinched when I moved closer. I realized she was protecting me from something she would not name. I said, "Emma, listen to me. I will fix this." She shook her head. "No one can." I said, "Watch me." She closed her eyes and said they used my name, my password. They said I transferred the money. I thought it was a routine transaction until I saw the account numbers when I questioned it. They turned on me. Daniel said I embarrassed him. I went to the police before they could, but it was already too late. They called it self-reporting, but no one believed me. I said, "Who is they?" She said, "You know," and walked away into the rain. I watched her go until she disappeared between the trees. I stood there soaked, but I could not leave. I looked inside her car again. There was a folder on the passenger seat half open. I saw copies of emails, invoices, signatures, all with her name. I took a picture of one page with my phone, then closed the door gently. I whispered, "I will not lose you again." On the drive back, my mind was sharp and quiet. Kept hearing Daniel's voice saying donors are watching, and Claire's saying she has no one to blame but herself. And now Emma's whisper saying, "It is not safe for you." Everything pointed back to the same place, the foundation, the place we built, together the place Daniel controlled like a kingdom. I knew then that the truth was inside those walls, and that finding it would cost something I could never get back. When I reached home, the morning news was playing on television. The reporter was talking about the investigation funds missing from the Bennett Foundation. Possible internal theft. The screen showed Emma's photo labeled under suspect. I turned it off before the next sentence. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Claire walked in. With a cup of coffee, she said, "Mom, you should stay out of this. Let the lawyers handle it." I asked her who gave the statement to the press. She hesitated and said, "Dad thought transparency was important." I said, "Transparency or distraction?" She said, "Mom, please stop. You are making this harder. I said, I am making it honest. She put the cup down too hard and left without another word. I spent the rest of the day in the study going through old files. There were stacks of reports, donation records, audit letters. I looked for patterns. I did not understand the numbers, but I understood behavior. Daniel was too organized for chaos to happen by accident. Someone had planned this and Emma had stumbled into it by being honest. I found a folder marked restricted access. It was empty except for a note that said, moved to archive. I knew what that meant. Hidden, not lost. That night, I could not sleep. The rain kept tapping against the window like a question I did not want to answer. I thought about Emma, sleeping in her car, how she must have felt when they accused her. How she must have looked for me and found only silence. I thought about the promise I made to protect her and how easily I had broken it. I whispered into the dark. I am sorry, my child, but I will make this right in the morning. I put on a plain coat, tied my hair back, and drove to the foundation building. It was early. The receptionist looked surprised to see me. I smiled politely and said, I just need to check the archives. She said, they are closed for maintenance. I said I will be quick. She hesitated, then handed me the key. I walked down the corridor, the smell of dust and paper filling the air. The archives were in the basement, dim light, flickering rows of boxes stacked neatly, each labeled by year. I opened the box marked current and found the missing reports. 3 months of transactions, redacted copies, but one detail stood out. The digital approval initials were Daniel's, not Emma's. I stood there holding the paper, my hands steady for the first time in days. I whispered they framed her, and then the realization settled heavy and cold. Daniel had known exactly what he was doing. He had chosen her as a shield, because she trusted him, and because I had been too, far away to see it coming. I felt no rage, only clarity, the kind that comes when pain hardens into purpose. I locked the archive door behind me and walked out into the daylight. The city was waking up, traffic starting, coffee cups clinking, life pretending. Nothing had changed, but everything had. I had a truth in my hands, and a daughter hiding in a car, and a husband who had built an empire on both. I got into my car and said quietly, "This ends now." That night, I returned to Emma's car. She was not there, but I left a note under her wiper. It said, "I believe you come home tomorrow, we start over." I sat for a while watching the empty parking lot, then drove back into the city lights, knowing that the silence inside my home was about to break. When I went back to the old community center the next morning, the fog was lifting, but the air still smelled of rain. The ground was soft and wet under my shoes. The silver car was still there, exactly where I had left it. Dew gathered on the windshield. As if the night had been kind enough to hide her for a few more hours, I walked closer, my heart beating quietly in my chest. I knocked on the window and waited no answer. Then slowly, the door opened from the inside, and she looked up at me. Her eyes, red, her face pale like someone who had not slept in days. She said in a small voice, "You came back," I said. "Of course I did." She said, "You should not have." And I said, "I am your mother. I will always come back." For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. The silence between us was full of everything we had not said in years. I could see how thin she had become, her hands trembling slightly when she tucked her hair behind her ear. There was a small paper cup near her seat, cold coffee half finished, and a folder on the dashboard. I asked her, "When did you last eat?" She shrugged and said, "I am fine." I said, "No, you are not." She looked away and said, "Mom, please go home. They will not stop if they see you here." I said, "Who will not stop?" She did not answer. Instead, she started crying again quietly, almost like she was afraid to be heard. I reached inside the car and took her hand. It felt cold and small. She said, "They think I took the money, but I didn't. I swear, I didn't." I said, "I know." And she said, "But the files, the passwords?" Everything points to me. I said, tell me exactly what happened, and she nodded slowly, wiping her tears. She told me she had found discrepancies in the donation records weeks ago. Small numbers moved between accounts. She had gone to the internal auditor who promised to look into it, but a few days later, those same transactions were labeled as hers. Someone had used her credentials. She confronted Daniel, her father, thinking he would protect her, but he told her to stay quiet, that the board did not need another scandal. She said he looked at her like a stranger. Then the police came. She thought it was a mistake until they read her name from the warrant. She said, I called Claire first, but she hung up. I said, and then she said, I called you, but you were away. I was scared. I did not know what to do. I went to the police station myself. I told them there was a misunderstanding. They said I should get a lawyer. I said, why did you not call me again? She said, I was ashamed. I thought maybe you believed them too. Her voice broke and I felt something inside me crack open. I said, Emma, listen to me. I will never believe that you could do this. She shook her head and said, you believed him once you chose him over me, and that silence stayed between us for a long time. The kind of silence that hurts more than words ever could. I said I was wrong. I should have protected you. I will. Now I promise. She said, it is too late. I said, not for me. She gave a small, bitter laugh and said, Mom, you cannot fight them. They control everything. The board, the accounts, even the police. I said they do not control the truth. And she said, truth does not matter if no one hears it. I looked at her and realized how much fear had shaped her. She was young, but already carrying the weight of betrayal. I said, then we will make them hear it. She asked how, and I said, I will find proof. I already found something, your father's initials on the approval reports. She froze and said what I said. I went to the archives yesterday. He was the one who signed those transfers. Not you. Her eyes filled again. She whispered, I knew it. I knew it. But I could not prove it. They said the files were corrupted. They deleted everything from my system. I said, we will rebuild it together. She said, they will come after you too. I said, let them. I am done being quiet. She looked away through the cracked window at the empty parking lot and said, I tried to protect you, Mom, when I found out what they were doing. I confronted Marcus. He laughed. Said, no one would believe me. Said your husband owed him favors from years ago. I recorded him once, but he took my phone. Said I was unstable. Told the board. I was emotional, that I needed rest. I felt my jaw tighten. She continued. I thought if I left quietly, it would end, but then money kept disappearing, and my name was on every document. I went to the police, but by then it was already too late. And now everyone thinks I am guilty. She turned to me and said they called me a thief. Mom, a thief. I have nothing. I sleep here because I cannot go anywhere else. I moved closer and put my arms around her. This time she did not pull away. She cried into my shoulder like she did when she was little. I said, you are coming home. She said, I cannot. I said, yes, you can. She said, what if he is there? I said, then he will leave. And she looked at me with disbelief. I said, this house, this family, this truth, it belongs to you, not him anymore. She nodded slowly, and I felt her body relax a little. For the first time, I saw the child she used to be, brave but gentle. I said, gather your things. She said, there is nothing left worth taking. I said, then we will start over with what we have. She smiled faintly and said, I missed you. Mom, and I said I missed you more. We drove back in silence. The road stretching ahead gray and endless when we reached the outskirts of the city. She suddenly said, pull over. I did. She said, there is something you should see. She opened the glove compartment and took out a small USB drive wrapped in a napkin. She said I copied one backup before they deleted the files. I did not look at it because I was afraid, but maybe it will help. I took it carefully, like it was glass, and said, Emma, this could change everything she said or make it worse. I said we will see. We reached home close to sunset. The lights were on inside. Claire's car parked neatly in the driveway. As soon as we entered, she appeared from the hallway, her face pale when she saw Emma. She said, "What is she doing here?" I said, "She lives here." Claire said, "Dad will not like this." I said, "Then he can move out." Claire glared at me and said, "You are destroying everything I said." "No, Claire, I am saving it." She turned and stormed upstairs. Emma stood still by the door. I said, "Ignore her. You belong here," she whispered. "It does not feel like home anymore." I said it will. She looked around slowly, like someone revisiting a dream, then followed me to the kitchen. I made her tea. She sat quietly holding the cup between her hands. I said, "You need rest tomorrow. We start fighting back." She said, "I do not know if I have any strength left." I said, "That is why you have me." Later that night, when she was asleep, I went to the study. I plugged the USB drive into the computer folder after folder opened on the screen, each filled with data, transactions, approvals, names, dates. I saw Marcus's name repeatedly, and next to it, Daniel's initials. My breath caught there. It was the whole chain, the proof she was innocent. I printed copies and locked them in a drawer. I heard footsteps behind me. It was Claire. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Fixing what your father broke." She said, "You are making a mistake." "He did this for the family," I said, "by ruining his daughter." She said, "You never understood him," I said, "and you never understood her." She frowned, said, "If you go public, you will regret it." I said, "Maybe, but not as much as staying silent." She left without another word, turned off the computer and sat back in the chair. The clock ticked loudly in the quiet room. I thought about how strange it was that truth always lived in such small spaces. A drive, a file, a line of numbers, and yet it could destroy or heal entire lives. When I went upstairs, I found Emma awake, sitting by the window. She said, "I cannot sleep." I said, "I know." She said, "What will happen now?" I said, "Tomorrow I will talk to a lawyer, someone I trust." She said, "Can we trust anyone?" I said, "Not many, but enough." She said, "What if Dad finds out?" I said, "He already knows. He just does not know what I am willing to do." She looked at me for a long time, then said, "You sound different." I said, "I am." She smiled faintly, said, "Stronger." I said, "No. Just finished being afraid." Leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Thank you, Mom." I said, "Do not thank me." "Yet we have a long road ahead." She said, "I am ready." I said so. Am. Outside the night was still, but inside something had shifted. The silence that once felt heavy now felt like waiting, like the pause before a storm, when everything holds its breath. I looked at her sleeping later and thought she called me crying from a police station. She said, "Mom, they say I did it," but she never told me what she really feared. Now I knew she had not been running from guilt. She had been running from betrayal, and that is a wound far deeper than any crime. Tomorrow the fight would begin, but tonight I let the quiet settle around us like protection and whispered into the dark, "You are safe now, I promise. Whatever it takes, I will bring the truth into the light, and I will make them answer for what they did to you." And for the first time in a very long time, I believed myself. Morning came quietly, but inside the house there was a tension that hummed like an electric wire. I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and sat by the kitchen window watching light spread across the garden. The air looked calm, but I could feel something shifting. Emma was still asleep upstairs. The dark circles under her eyes had softened just a little. I wanted her to have one morning without fear. I opened the drawer where I had locked the printed pages from the USB drive. The evidence was there. Black ink on white paper. Numbers, names, signatures, each one heavy with meaning. I ran my finger down the list of transactions. Every line whispered the same thing. Daniel and Marcus had built this lie together. They had used Emma's login. They had moved the money, and then they had buried her beneath it. I drove to the old lawyer who had helped with the foundation's charter years ago. His name was Thomas, a quiet man who valued truth more than friendship. When I walked into his office, he looked surprised. I said, "I need your help." He said, "You always came to talk about art, not war." I said, "This is both." I laid the papers on his desk. He read slowly, his eyes narrowing. He said, "These are internal approvals. You should not have them." I said, "They concern my daughter." He looked at me for a long time and said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want the truth to breathe again." He said, "This will destroy Daniel's career." I said he destroyed our child's first. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said, "You will need more than printouts. You will need timestamps, metadata logs, witness statements." He said quietly, "Do you have access to the internal server?" I said no, but I know someone who might. He said, "Be careful the people you are about to expose. Do not lose." Politely, I said, "Neither do mothers who have nothing left to lose." When I left his office, the wind had picked up dry leaves spinning in circles. I drove straight to the foundation building again. This time, I did not park in front. I went. Around the back entrance, the security guard knew me from years ago. He smiled, said Mrs. Bennett. "It has been a while." I said yes. "I just need to pick up some personal files." He waved me through. Inside the corridors smelled of dust and perfume of old paperwork and recent guilt. I walked toward the archive room, but halfway down the hall I heard voices. Daniel and Marcus standing near the conference room door. Daniel's tone was low but sharp. He said the audit meeting is tomorrow if she brings anything up. "We deny everything," Marcus said. "What about the girl?" Daniel said she will disappear again. Her mother is sentimental but manageable. My hand tightened on the folder I was holding. I forced myself to keep walking quietly past them. My heels, barely touching the floor, I reached the stairwell and breathed. I unlocked the archive room. The light flickered weakly. I opened the cabinet marked Digital Backups and pulled out a small black drive labeled Month 11 Current. I slipped it into my bag and left before anyone saw me. My heart was steady, not from calm, but from clarity. On the way home, I kept thinking about their voices, manageable. That was the word Daniel had used about me, as if love made me soft, as if years of silence meant I had forgotten how to fight at home. Emma was awake, sitting on the couch wrapped in a blanket. She said, "Where were you?" I said, "Gathering what we need." She looked worried. I said, "Do you trust me?" She nodded slowly. I said, "Then listen tomorrow." "I will. Go to the board meeting. I will bring the truth." She said they will not listen. I said they will when I speak their language, numbers, signatures, power. She handed me her phone, said I charged it for the first time in weeks. I looked at the screen and saw unread messages. One from an unknown number. It said, "Stop digging." Another said, "Your daughter is not safe." My breath caught. I said, "When did these come?" She said, "Last night. I thought they were spam." I said, "They are warnings." She said, "Maybe we should." "Stop," I said, "no. That is what they want." That evening Thomas called. He said I spoke with an old contact at the forensic accounting firm. They can verify digital logs if we have the original drive. I said, "I have it." He said, "Send it tonight before anyone knows." I said, "I will." He said also, "Record your meeting tomorrow. Even if they threaten you, you need a record." I said, "Thank you, Thomas." He said, "I always told your husband never to underestimate you." He did not listen. After the call, I went upstairs. Emma was looking out of the window. She said, "The stars look close tonight." I said, "Maybe because we finally stopped running." She smiled faintly, said, "I dreamed of the shelter again, the one I wanted to build." I said, "You still can." She said, "Not after this." I said, "Especially after this." The next morning, the house was silent. Claire's door closed. Daniel already gone. I dressed simply. Black suit hair, tied back. The calm armor of a woman who has already chosen her side. Emma stood at the door, said, "Do you want me to come?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "Promise you will be careful." I said, "Always." She said, "Mom, I am proud of you." I said, "Then it was worth it." At the foundation, the meeting room was filled with the smell of expensive coffee and tension. The board members looked up when I entered. Daniel sat at the head of the table, Marcus beside him, both pretending not to see me. I placed a small folder on the table. Daniel said, "This is a private meeting?" I said, "So is betrayal." He said, "You are upset. We can discuss this later." I said, "No. We will discuss it now." I opened the folder and spread the papers across the table. "These are the transaction logs from last quarter. These initials are yours, not Emma's. This account belongs to Marcus's consulting firm, and these deposits match the missing funds." The room went very still. Marcus laughed, said, "Where did you get those?" I said, "From the truth." Daniel said, "You are misinformed. Those documents are stolen." I said, "Then you should call the police again. Maybe this time they will arrest the right person, one of the older board members." Mrs. Gray picked up a page, adjusted her glasses, and said, "This signature matches yours, Daniel." She looked at me, then back at him. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Daniel said, "You do not know what you are doing." I said, "I know exactly what I am doing. I am ending your story of control." He stood up, voice raised, said, "This will ruin everything." I said, "Only what deserves to be ruined." Marcus muttered something about lawyers. I turned to him and said, "I have already spoken to one. The forensic report is on its way." Daniel looked at me with something between anger and fear. He said, "You will regret this." I said, "Maybe, but at least my daughter will sleep tonight." I gathered the papers back into the folder and said, "You both built this empire on trust, and now you will watch it collapse under the weight of your own lies." I walked out without looking back in the hallway. My legs felt light, like I was finally walking toward air. Not away from it. Outside, the sky had turned gray. Thomas was waiting in his car. He rolled down the window and said, "How did it go?" I said, "Exactly as expected." He smiled faintly, said, "Good now. Send me the digital drive." I handed it to him. He said, "This will confirm everything. Once the report is official, we will go to the authorities." I said, "Thank you." He said, "No, thank your courage." When I returned home, Emma was pacing. She said, "I saw a news alert. Someone leaked the audit meeting to the press." I said, "That was me." She blinked and said, "You wanted them to know." I said, "I wanted everyone to know. Truth travels faster when it is public." She hugged me so tightly I could feel her heartbeat against mine. She said I was so afraid. I said, "Me too, but fear does not get to choose anymore." That night we sat together in the quiet living room. The same space that once held so many lies now filled only with the ticking of the clock. She said, "What happens now?" I said, "They will try to fight back, but the documents are already verified. The law will do its part," she said. "Do you hate him?" I said. "I don't know. I hate what he became." She looked thoughtful and said, "I used to think you were fragile." I said, "So did I." She smiled, said, "You are not." I said, "Neither are you." We sat in silence for a while outside. Thunder rolled somewhere far away, the storm that had been gathering for months, finally breaking over us. But instead of fear, I felt peace, the kind that comes after truth has finally been spoken. Before going to bed, I looked at the folder on the table, the hidden ledger that had lived in shadows for too long. I thought of how many stories end with noise and shouting, but ours had begun in whispers and would end in calm truth. I turned off the lights and whispered into the dark. You called me from a police station, they said you did it, but tonight, the only thing you are guilty of is surviving what they did to you. And for the first time since that call, I felt that the silence in our house was not empty anymore. It was waiting for healing. Morning light fell through the curtains like thin gold lines, and for a moment I thought maybe it was over. Maybe peace had finally found its way back into our house, but peace never comes so quietly. It waits behind doors, pretending to be silence. I was making coffee when my phone buzzed. It was Thomas. He said the forensic report is complete. They verified the files, every transfer, every approval. It all traces back to Daniel and Marcus. He paused, then said, "But there is something else you should know. They used your name once in a backup authorization." For a moment, the room tilted. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Daniel used your credentials to approve one of the minor accounts. It was his way of ensuring that if the truth ever surfaced, you would fall with him." I closed my eyes and breathed slowly. He said, "Do not worry. We can prove it was forged." But it explains why he was so calm for years. He had prepared a shield made from me. When I hung up the phone, I stood there staring out of the window. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. I had lived with his betrayal for so long that it had become part of the air I breathed. But this was different. This was not just a lie. This was design. Emma came down the stairs. Her hair tied back, still pale but stronger. She said, "You look worried." I said nothing. She said, "Is it about Dad?" I nodded. She said, "What did he do this time?" I said he used my name once. She froze and said, "Why would he do that?" I said to protect himself. She whispered, "He never stops, does he?" I said no, not until we stop him. We spent the next hours gathering everything Thomas had sent me. Printed emails, records, voice notes, all of it. We spread them across the dining table. The sunlight made the pages glow like fragile evidence of years of deceit. Emma said, "Do you think he will come here?" I said maybe. She said, "What will you say?" I said whatever. Truth demands. By afternoon, it was no longer a question of if. But when I received a message from Claire, it said, "Dad wants to see you alone. Do not bring her." I read it twice. And then again, I showed it to Emma. She said, "Do not go." I said, "I have to." She said, "He will twist it." I said, "Let him. I will not break this time." When I arrived at the old house, the one that used to be ours, the air felt heavy with memory. Daniel was in the study, standing by the window like he always did when he wanted to appear thoughtful. He turned when I entered, said, "You look tired." I said, "I am tired of lies." He smiled faintly, said, "So melodramatic, always." I said, "You forged my name." He said, "Come now, we both know how business works." I said this was not business. This was our family. He said it was survival. I said, "At whose cost?" He poured himself a drink. The ice cracked loudly. He said Emma was careless. She should have stayed out of the books. She did this to herself. I said she was trying to protect us. He said, "From what truth is inconvenient?" I said truth is sacred. He laughed. Said, "Not in this world." I stepped closer. Said, "You framed your own daughter." He said, "I protected our legacy." I said, "You destroyed it." He said, "No. You did when you brought her back. She was meant to disappear quietly. You never could let things go. Could you? I said, you used my name. He said insurance in case you turned against me. He took a sip of his drink and said, you always were emotional. I felt the anger rise, but I kept my voice calm. I said, you think control makes you powerful, but power without love is nothing. He said love is currency, and I spent it wisely. I said, not anymore. He looked at me with mild amusement until I placed the small recorder on the desk. His smile faltered. He said, what is that? I said, my insurance? I pressed play. His own words echoed back from the meeting room recording Thomas had recovered, from the digital logs. Daniel's voice saying she will disappear again. Her mother is manageable. His face drained of color. He said, where did you get that? I said, from the truth. He moved forward. Said, give me that device. I said, no. He said, you will regret this. I said maybe, but not as much as living beside a stranger for 20 years. I walked past him to the door. He said, you will destroy everything. I said, then let it burn. He shouted, you will ruin Claire's future. I said, I already did when I stayed silent too long as I left. I heard the glass shatter behind me when I reached the car. I could still hear his voice echoing through the open window shouting my name, but it no longer sounded like power. It sounded like panic. Back home, Emma was waiting on the porch. She ran to me, said, are you okay? I said, yes. She said, did he hurt you? I said, not anymore. She looked at my hand, still holding the recorder, and said, you got him, didn't you? I said, I got the truth. She said, what happens now? I said, now we make it official. That evening, Thomas called again. He said, the report is submitted. The legal team will file tomorrow. Once it hits the press, the board will have no choice. Daniel and Marcus will both be investigated. I said, thank you. He said, I do not thank courage often, but yours deserves it. Later that night, I sat by Emma's bedside. She was reading the old shelter proposal. Her fingers tracing the faded ink, she said, do you think people can change? I said, sometimes pain makes them, she said, and him. I said, some people never look in the mirror long enough to see what they became. She nodded, said, I do not hate him. I just wish he had loved us differently. I said, that wish is what keeps you human. The next day, the story broke. Headlines flashing across every screenboard. Scandal CEO under investigation. Charity fraud. Daniel Bennett accused of embezzlement. Marcus Green facing charges. I watched the news silently. The world finally hearing what we had whispered for months. Claire called, her voice trembling. She said, what did you do? I said, I told the truth. She said, you destroyed Dad. I said, no, he destroyed himself. She said, people will talk. I said, let them. She hung up crying. I sat there listening to the dial tone thinking, how strange it is that truth costs everyone something. By evening, reporters were outside the gates, flashing lights, shouting questions. Emma stood behind me, hand on my shoulder. She whispered, should we hide? I said, no. We have hidden long enough. When the noise faded and the sun went down, the house grew quiet again. I went to the living room, sat where everything had begun, the folder of evidence now empty on the table. Emma sat beside me, said, is it really over? I said, almost. She said, what if he comes here? I said, he will not. He is too busy explaining to the world how his wife and daughter outsmarted him. She smiled softly, said, I never thought I would feel safe again. I said, safety is not a place. It is a truth you stand in. She said, and what is yours? I said that love is still stronger than betrayal, if you choose it to be. Outside thunder rolled again, distant but familiar. I said, maybe we should rebuild the shelter. She looked surprised, said, now. I said yes now because this fight cannot end with anger. It has to end with purpose. She smiled. Said, then we start tomorrow. That night I went to bed knowing peace would not come easily, but it would come on our terms, not his. Before closing my eyes, I whispered to the darkness my daughter called me crying from the police station. They said she did it. But tonight the whole world knows who really did. And somewhere deep inside the silence, I felt a strange glow. Not of revenge alone, but of something purer, the quiet satisfaction of truth. Finally standing tall, the night the truth came out was colder than I expected. The air had that heavy stillness that only arrives before a storm. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside, flashes of light from distant cameras still crowding the streets. Everyone wanted a statement, a soundbite, an explanation. But I had already given the world what it needed, the truth. The rest was between me, him, and the silence that had grown between us for years. Thomas called earlier that evening. He said the board had scheduled an emergency meeting, not to discuss business, but to formally remove Daniel and Marcus. I told him I would be there. He hesitated and said, "Are you sure you want to face him again?" I said, "I'm not facing him. I'm facing the end of what he built on lies." When I arrived, the building was lit up like it was daylight. Security was tighter now. I could see the faces of people who had once smiled at us in charity galas now looking away in discomfort. Whispers followed me down the hallway, words like brave and reckless floating behind. I walked past them quietly. I had no interest in vindication. I only wanted closure. Inside the boardroom, everything looked the same. Polished table, crystal water glasses, expensive art on the wall. But it felt hollow, stripped of its illusion. Daniel was already there, sitting in his old chair. His suit was immaculate, but his eyes betrayed him. The calm arrogance was gone. In its place sat the look of a man who finally realized the empire had fallen. Marcus sat beside him, pale and silent, his confidence gone too. Mrs. Gray, the senior board member, called the meeting to order. Her voice was steady but cold. "We have reviewed the forensic findings," she said. "It is clear the Foundation's accounts were misused and evidence was fabricated against Emma Bennett. The board has voted unanimously to terminate both Mr. Bennett and Mr. Green effective immediately." There was a murmur of shock around the room. Daniel's hands tightened on the table. He said, "You're making a mistake. Everything you're reading was orchestrated by my wife. She's been manipulating this from the start." I looked at him, calm and unshaken. "If you're going to accuse me," I said softly, "do it with something more than fear." He slammed his hand against the table. "You ruined me!" he shouted. "No," I said quietly. "You ruined yourself the moment you used your own child as a scapegoat." Mrs. Gray raised a hand. "Enough," she said firmly. "Mr. Bennett, you are no longer in charge here. The authorities will continue their investigation. Mrs. Bennett, we thank you for your cooperation." He looked at me one last time. A look that carried 20 years of resentment, pride, and defeat. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. But pity has no place where truth has already spoken. As I walked out, reporters crowded the entrance again. Microphones flashed. Questions filled the air. "How do you feel? Will your daughter return to the Foundation? Do you have anything to say to your husband?" I stopped just long enough to say, "Truth doesn't need a press conference. It needs courage." Then I walked past them, the flashbulbs flickering like lightning in a storm that no longer scared me. At home, Emma was waiting. She stood at the door, nervous. "How did it go?" she asked. "It's done," I said. "He's out." "They both are." She exhaled, her shoulders trembling with relief. I placed my hands on her face and said, "You are free now." She hugged me so tightly that I could feel her heartbeat against mine. When she pulled back, she said, "I never thought this day would come." "It came," I said, "because you stood up when everyone else stayed silent." We sat in the living room for hours without speaking much. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. The storm outside finally broke, rain falling hard against the windows. I looked at her and said, "Do you remember the day we brought you home?" "You wouldn't stop crying," she smiled faintly. "You said I cried because I already knew this family would be dramatic." I laughed softly. "You were right." Her face turned serious again. "Mom," she said, "what happens now?" "What about him?" I looked into her eyes and said, "He'll face what he created. The courts, the questions, the empty house. That's his punishment, living with the echoes of what he destroyed." Later that night, when she went to sleep, I stepped outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. The garden lights cast soft halos over the wet grass. I could almost see the ghosts of our old life fading away. The parties, the laughter, the illusions. All gone. What remained was the simple truth that we had survived. A car pulled up quietly by the gate. Thomas stepped out with an envelope. He said, "I thought you might want to see this." Inside were the final documents, official confirmation that Emma had been cleared of all charges, and a note from the board reinstating her reputation publicly. I held the papers for a long time, feeling the weight lift off my chest. "It's over," I said quietly. He nodded. "It's over, but it began something better." As he left, I looked back at the house. The lights were warm again. Inside, my daughter was asleep peacefully for the first time in months. I whispered to the wind, "You're safe now." But as I turned to go inside, I saw a car parked down the street. Dark, silent, unmoving. A silhouette sat behind the wheel. My instincts tightened. I watched for a moment until the headlights flicked on and the car drove away slowly into the rain. My breath caught, not from fear, but from awareness. Stories like ours never end neatly. Some wounds never fully close. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and stood in the quiet hallway. On the wall hung the family photo, the one from years ago. I took it down, wiped the dust off, and placed it face down in a drawer. Some memories do not deserve display. As I climbed the stairs, I heard Emma stir in her sleep. She murmured something, my name maybe, and I smiled. She was dreaming peacefully. That was all that mattered. Before I turned off the lights, I whispered, "You called me crying once. They said you did it. But tonight, the only thing you've done is survive." I stood there for a long time, listening to the rhythm of rain against the roof, the sound of calm finally finding its way back into our lives. In the morning, the world would move on. The headlines would fade. People would find new scandals to whisper about. But for us, this was the beginning of something purer. Not revenge, not victory, but rebirth. And as the first light of dawn touched the sky, I finally felt what I had been chasing all along. Not justice, not revenge, but peace. Morning came softly that day. No alarms, no calls, no voices arguing behind closed doors. Only the sound of gentle rain fading on the windows. For the first time in months, the house felt alive again. The air did not carry fear anymore, only the quiet echo of peace returning after a long exile. I stood in the doorway of Emma's room watching her sleep, her hair loose on the pillow, one hand resting on her stomach as if protecting more than just herself. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of coffee and lemon. Light spilled across the counter, touching the framed photographs I had finally turned face up again. Some faces in those pictures belonged to people we had lost, not to death, but to truth. Still, I kept them there. Because healing is not about forgetting. It's about remembering without bleeding. The world outside had already moved on. Headlines had shifted to new scandals, new names. The noise that once surrounded us had quieted. Daniel was facing trial now. Marcus had confessed. Claire had left the city for a while. There were messages from her sometimes, short, apologetic, uncertain. I always answered gently, "Take your time. We'll be here when you're ready to come home." Forgiveness does not erase what happened, but it frees the one who gives it. That morning, Emma came down wearing one of my old sweaters. She looked stronger, calmer. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from me. For a long moment, we said nothing. Then she smiled and said, "It's strange, isn't it? The silence feels different now. It's not heavy anymore. I nodded. That's because it belongs to us again. She looked out of the window and said, I was thinking about the shelter. Maybe it's time. I smiled. Then it's time. Let's build it properly this time, with walls of honesty, not pride. She laughed softly. And in that sound I heard the girl she used to be, the one who used to chase sunlight through the garden when she was little. Later, we drove to the old lot near the river where she had dreamed of starting her shelter years ago. The building was abandoned but still standing. Paint peeling, glass cracked, but the bones were strong. We walked through it quietly. She touched the walls and said, It's broken, but not beyond repair. I said, So were we. We spent hours drawing plans, making lists, imagining laughter echoing through those halls again. Hope has a way of painting even the darkest places with light. By afternoon, we had agreed. This was where it would begin. A new chapter built not from what we lost, but from what survived. On the drive home, she turned to me and said, Do you ever miss him? I thought for a while and said, I miss who I thought he was. But sometimes love is just the hope that someone will become what you see in them. When they don't, you have to let go of the hope, not the lesson. She nodded quietly, eyes fixed on the road ahead. At home, we found a letter slipped under the door. It was from Claire, the handwriting shaky. Mom, Emma, I'm sorry. I didn't know how deep it went. I believed him because I was afraid not to. I'm ready to tell the truth if you'll have me. Emma read it twice, tears in her eyes. She whispered, Do we? I said, Of course. The only way we stay whole is by letting light back in. That night, Claire came home. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, older somehow. Emma crossed the room first. For a heartbeat, I thought they might fall apart again, but then Emma simply wrapped her arms around her sister. No words, no explanations, just forgiveness heavy and real. I stood watching them, my heart full and quiet. The family that had shattered was finding its shape again, not perfect, but honest. Weeks passed. The foundation released its final statement clearing Emma publicly. Donations began flowing again under a new board. People whispered apologies in hallways, sent polite messages, pretended they had always believed us. We did not need their approval anymore. Truth had done its job. In early spring, we opened the doors to the new shelter. Fresh paint, warm lights, the smell of clean wood. A small sign by the entrance read, The Haven, founded by Emma Bennett. As we cut the ribbon, reporters asked questions, cameras clicked, but this time the noise felt different. It wasn't judgment, it was witness. After the ceremony, Emma sat on the front steps holding a tiny child from the local foster home. She looked up at me and said, You know, she reminds me of me. I smiled. Then take care of her the way you needed someone to take care of you. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and kissed the child's forehead. That evening, we walked by the river. The city lights shimmered on the water. She said, Do you think people ever truly heal? I said, Not all at once. Healing comes quietly, like dawn. You don't notice it until you look back and realize the dark has faded. She slipped her arm through mine and whispered, Thank you for coming back for me. I said, You called, remember? I just answered. When we reached home, the house felt alive again. Claire was in the kitchen, humming softly, preparing tea. A baby's laugh echoed from the next room, Emma's foster daughter, now part of our family's new story. I walked upstairs to the study and opened the drawer where the old USB drive still rested. I held it for a moment, then locked it away for good. The past had served its purpose. Before bed, I looked out the window. The garden was blooming again, the same soil that had once seen storms now growing wild with color. I thought about everything we had survived, betrayal, fear, loss, and I realized none of it had broken us. It had carved us into something stronger. I turned off the lights, walked down the hall, and paused at Emma's door. She was reading to the little girl, her voice soft and steady. Once there was a woman who thought she had lost everything, she read, but she found that love, once tested, becomes unbreakable. When she finished, She looked up at me and smiled. "Good night, Mom," I said. "Good night, my heart." I went to my room, lay down, and closed my eyes. The house was still but not empty. It was full of quiet hope. I thought of that night in Florence, the phone call that had shattered my peace. I remembered her voice trembling. "Mom, they say I did it." I smiled softly in the dark and whispered, "You did nothing wrong, my darling. You just survived the storm that made us who we are." Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere, a new day was waiting to begin. And with that, I let sleep take me, not in fear, but in peace, knowing that this time the story had finally found its glow. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who has ever fought quietly for love and truth. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we win in silence. And if you believe that healing begins with courage, stay with us for the next story. Just tap the video on your screen now.